Welcome back. The mists of Camelot have not yet lifted. The boy with the sword has become a king, and the dream he imagined is beginning to take shape in the golden air. Tonight, we return to that dream, to the sound of hammers shaping a round table, to voices of knights swearing oaths by firelight, to laughter echoing through candlelit halls. In this chapter, Camelot is born not of stone, but of faith, of friendship, of mercy, and of fragile hope. So, wherever you are, wrap yourself in the quiet, and let us return to the fellowship of the Round Table. The mornings of Camelot were not like other mornings. They rose out of mist, soft and reluctant, as though dawn itself wished to linger beneath the quilts of dream a little longer. The first light did not shout. It seeped through the high windows of the great hall, across the new-laid stones, still smelling faintly of rain, along the carved beams that now knew the weight of laughter and prayer. The sun touched everything, as if testing its patience, as if asking, "Are you ready to be remembered?" Arthur often woke before the bell. Before the fires were stirred, he would walk barefoot through the hall, feeling the cool stone underfoot, the hush that waited like breath held between heartbeats. The crown rested where he had left it, not upon a cushion, but upon the edge of the round table itself, among the marks of knives and cups, as if to remind him that even kings must dine beside their people. The sword Excalibur hung at his hip, its edge sleeping but never dreaming. In those early hours, before the day's armor clattered awake, he would stand at the open doors of the hall and watch Camelot breathe. The city had grown like moss, quietly, patiently, filling every crack of the hill. Smoke curled from 100 chimneys. The clatter of hooves and laughter of children braided with the sound of bells and the distant rush of river water. From above, it might have looked like light learning to live inside stone. When the knights gathered each morning, it was not in splendor, but in quiet purpose. They came not as warriors first, but as guardians of the promise carved into the grain of the Round Table. "We will listen." They took their seats without rank. No name was carved higher than another. Each man's chair bore his own hand's work, polished, mended, smoothed by his sweat. When the hall filled with them, there was a warmth that did not come from fire. Arthur would begin not with command, but with question. "What have you seen?" he would ask. And one by one, they would tell. A merchant whose ships had returned safely through a storm because a fisherman had shared his map. A farmer who had cut his harvest and given half to a widow before his own barns were full. A patrol that had met bandits and found them hungry, not cruel, and brought them home instead of in chains. The stories were not victories. They were mercies, small, unremarkable mercies that built the kingdom the way threads build cloth, unseen but unbreakable. Merlin, often silent at the edge of the gathering, would close his eyes as he listened. "These," he would whisper to himself, "are the miracles the gods prefer, the ones that do not ask to be noticed." In time, word of Camelot spread like a tune no one could quite remember how to begin. But everyone could hum. Men of distant shires rode through rain and hunger to kneel before Arthur and ask for a place at his table. He did not accept all who came. He looked not at their armor, but at their hands, their eyes, their silence. Those who carried pride like perfume, he sent away kindly. Those who carried doubt like a scar, he welcomed. Among the first were the brothers Gawain and Gareth, red-haired and fiery, whose tempers could light a room but whose laughter could mend one just as quickly. There was Tristan, the harper knight, whose sword sang when it left its sheath, and whose heart broke too easily for peace. There was Bedivere, steadfast and silver-eyed, who spoke little and always true. And there was Lancelot, already the brightest flame among them, though he tried, with all the humility he could muster, to hide it beneath ash. He rode not for glory, but for atonement no one could name. His courage was wordless, and it spread like a kind of contagion. Arthur saw them all and thought, here is the dream taking shape, men made brothers by honor, not by blood. The first council of the Round Table began on a day heavy with golden mist. Rain had passed in the night, and the air smelled of grass and wet iron. The torches were unlit. The light came entirely from the sky, diffused through the windows like the breath of angels. Arthur took his seat as an equal among them. When he spoke, his words seemed to drift more than fall. We have built walls, he said, but walls mean nothing unless they shelter the weary. We have forged swords, but they are useless unless they protect the innocent. Let our kingdom be known not by its towers, but by the kindness of its fields, by the safety of its roads. Let the traveler who walks by night say, here I am not afraid. A murmur moved through the nights, not of applause, but of assent, quiet, deep, the sound of purpose finding its rhythm. Gawain spoke first. And if the darkness rises again, my king? Arthur looked at him, his expression gentle. Then we will not meet it with anger, but with light. Light does not hate the dark. It simply shines at that. Merlin, who had been tracing circles in the dust beside his chair, raised his eyes. Then remember, my lord, he said, light also casts a shadow. Guard it well, or it will grow hungry. Arthur met his gaze, and for a moment the air thickened, as though both saw beyond the present the shape of something waiting. A wound yet unborn, a sorrow inevitable as sunset. Then the king smiled softly and broke the heaviness with a nod. Then we will feed our shadow with compassion, he said. That afternoon, they rode out together for the first time. 12 knights, the king and the wizard. The sky was pale and low, the air sharp with pine. Hooves pressed the wet earth, leaving prints that filled slowly with silver water. Birds scattered, startled but unafraid. They rode not to conquer, but to be seen, to show the people that their oaths were not decoration, but flesh. They passed through villages, where roofs still sagged from old wars, where faces looked up from work in cautious wonder. Arthur dismounted often, taking a farmer's hand, kneeling to speak with children, lifting buckets beside women at the wells. He spoke to each as if time itself had paused for their conversation. By dusk, when they camped beside the river, no one called him Lord. They called him Arthur, and that was enough. Merlin watched him from across the fire, his eyes reflecting the flames. You led not by rule, he murmured, but by reminder. You remind them what they once were, and could be again. Arthur stirred the fire with a branch. Sparks leapt into the night and vanished. I only remind myself, he said. The rest follows. Above them the stars opened like seeds in fertile soil. The river hummed softly, and the mist, drawn by the warmth of the flames, curled around their circle, until it seemed the very night had joined their fellowship. And there, under the gaze of the heavens, the first true brotherhood of Camelot was born, not of blood or war, but of faith. Faith that the world could, for a time, be mended by gentleness. In those first months, Camelot learned the rhythm of peace, a rhythm slower than battle, gentler than ambition. The clang of armor gave way to the music of work. Hammers on iron, yes, but also the hum of women weaving flax, the murmur of monks copying prayers, the laughter of children chasing sunlight across the courtyards. At dusk, the city glowed, not with torches of fear, but with hearths. Smoke rose in blue curls, carrying the scent of pine resin, of bread, of the sweet damp of the river. The sound of bells drifted over the roofs like birds returning home. And in the great hall, where the round table waited, the fellowship gathered as stars gather, slowly, until the night was full. They spoke of the day's ride, of disputes settled, of fields saved from flood. Sometimes they argued. Sometimes they fell into laughter that rolled like distant thunder. But even in their mirth, there was discipline. The calm weight of men who knew what their hands could do and chose not to. Arthur listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was never to end a conversation, but to open it. "We are not the measure of right," he said once. "We are only its students." It was Bedivere who answered, his voice rough from smoke and age. "Then may we never graduate, my king." That night the hall shook with laughter, and even Merlin smiled, which was rarer and more precious than prophecy. On clear nights, they would feast in the open courtyard, beneath banners that moved softly in the wind. The moonlight painted the flagstones silver, and the air smelled of mint and firewood. Minstrels sang of lands far away, and women from the kitchens joined in with their own songs. Songs not of kings or heroes, but of rivers, harvests, and the small holiness of daily life. Arthur often slipped away during these feasts, stepping out into the meadow where the torches ended and the darkness began. There, he could hear the night breathing, the frogs in the reeds, the sigh of trees turning in their sleep. Sometimes Merlin found him there. "You vanish like a ghost," the wizard would say, his voice more fond than reproachful. "I only go to remember," Arthur replied. "When men cheer too long, they forget why they began." Merlin nodded, leaning on his staff. "The hardest thing, my king, is not to win hearts. It is to keep them soft once you have." Arthur smiled faintly. "Then I shall walk softly too." Among the fellowship, bonds deepened like roots. Lancelot, quiet and bright, became the king's shadow, riding beside him through rain and silence alike. His skill was unmatched, but it was his gentleness that people remembered. He spoke little, but when he smiled, the world seemed momentarily forgiven. Gawain was fire, quick to anger, quicker to laughter, generous to a fault. His heart was wild as the wind on the moors. When he swore loyalty, it sounded more like a vow to a god than to a man. Percival was the dreamer, the one who gazed too long at the horizon, who saw in every star a question waiting to be answered. The others teased him for it, but when his clear eyes lifted, even their teasing softened into wonder. Each man brought something the kingdom needed, and each found something they did not know they were missing: belonging. Merlin called them the 12 lights of Camelot. But even stars, he warned softly, cast shadows. One evening, near midsummer, the queen arrived. Her name was Guinevere. She came not in jewels, but in pale linen, her cloak the color of unlit flame. Her eyes were not the blue of sky, but of river water under moonlight, calm, moving, unknowable. When she entered the hall, conversation faded as if someone had drawn a veil over sound. Arthur rose to greet her. The air between them shifted, not with thunder, but with that deep stillness that sometimes comes before the first drop of rain. "Welcome," he said softly. She bowed, her voice low. "I have come because my father sent me with gifts for the king who keeps the borders safe. But I will stay," she added after a pause, "because I have heard there is kindness here." The king's eyes warmed. "Then you will never lack for home." Merlin watched them from the shadows, the ghost of a smile passing his lips, not of joy, but of inevitability. The queen became part of the hall as naturally as dawn becomes part of morning. Her laughter softened the edges of the table's solemnity. Her presence seemed to bless the air itself. Even the dogs followed her when she walked. And yet, in the corner of that golden peace, a new silence was born. The kind that grows where hearts begin to speak in glances rather than words. Lancelot, whose armor had never failed him, began to find it heavy. The sound of his own heartbeat confused him. It no longer matched the rhythm of duty alone. He would look away when she smiled, and she, perhaps without meaning to, smiled more often. Arthur saw none of it then. He loved them both too dearly to suspect the slow betrayal of fate. As summer deepened, Camelot blossomed into legend. The tournaments that followed were not of cruelty, but of joy, contests of skill, of music, of wit. The people came from every valley, their carts filled with laughter and baskets of apples, their children running barefoot through the fields of gold. On the day of the first great festival, the sky itself seemed to bless the land, vast and blue, brushed with white. Arthur sat beneath a canopy of linen with Guinevere at his side. Lancelot tilted his lance in salute, sunlight catching his polished armor so fiercely it dazzled the eye. The trumpet sounded, horses thundered, the banners snapped like wings, the air was thick with dust and glory. When the match was done, and Lancelot dismounted to kneel before his king, Arthur laid a hand on his shoulder and said, "You bring honor to us all, my friend." Lancelot bowed his head, but his eyes sought the queen. She smiled, gently, painfully, and the moment passed like a heartbeat, unseen by all but destiny. That night, the hall burned with light. Cups were raised, songs were sung, and joy moved from mouth to mouth like fire leaping from torch to torch. But Merlin sat apart, his eyes distant. He saw in the laughter the trembling of something too perfect, too bright to last. He leaned toward Arthur and spoke low, his voice rough as wind through dry grass. "Remember, my king, when men build heaven on earth, the earth remembers it is mortal." Arthur nodded slowly, though his gaze lingered on his people, on the knights, on the queen, on the hope that glowed in every face. "Then we shall live our heaven while it lasts," he said. Merlin smiled faintly. "And when it ends, may it fall as softly as snow." Outside, beyond the laughter and the music, the river moved in silver coils through the night. The stars hung above the towers, bright and patient. Somewhere deep beneath that same sky, in the lake where the lady waited, the water stirred, sensing the first tremor of change. Camelot slept, dreaming golden dreams. And somewhere in those dreams, the first shadow began to move. Camelot gleamed beneath a sky of perfect gold. The sun rose slow and gracious above its towers, catching in the high windows, the shields hung to dry, the rippling banners embroidered by patient hands. Every street shone like a prayer answered. The air carried the scent of lavender and hay, the sound of laughter, of hooves, of water running down the carved channels of the courtyards. From the walls to the river, everything breathed harmony. And yet, harmony, when too perfect, becomes a silence that listens too closely to itself. Arthur walked through his city at dawn. No guard followed him. He needed none. He moved like light moves through leaves, seen, then unseen, soft and inevitable. The people bowed as he passed, but not out of fear. Children ran beside him, their small feet scattering pigeons. Merchants greeted him with their palms dusted in flour, and goldsmiths raised their heads from their benches to nod. He smiled at them. But something inside him, something small and wordless, had begun to ache. He did not know why. It was not loneliness. He had never been more surrounded, nor was it sorrow. Camelot was full of laughter. It was the ache that comes when the heart's senses change before the eyes can see it. The ache of a tide turning beneath a calm sea. Merlin saw it too. He had begun to spend more time in the high tower at the city's edge, the one that looked toward the forest of Broceliande, where the mists never lifted entirely. There, he watched the clouds move and read in them the shape of things not yet born. His eyes, which once gleamed with mischief, had grown still, as if they now reflected only what the future allowed. Sometimes, the knights would climb the tower to seek his counsel, and he would smile and say little, a blessing disguised as silence. But at night, when the city slept, he would whisper to the wind, "The candle burns beautifully, but too fast. I smell the wax melting already." The days passed in golden procession. The tournaments continued, the songs grew louder, and the round table stood always full. Lancelot's skill had become legend. His name carried beyond the walls like sunlight on armor. But his peace had begun to thin. Each time he knelt before the queen after victory, each time she offered him a garland of ivy and rose, his breath shortened, and hers. The crowd would cheer, oblivious, their joy a bright veil that hid two hearts trembling beneath. In the evenings, when the feasts ended and the hall grew quiet, Guinevere would remain by the dying fire, her hands folded, her thoughts heavy. Sometimes Arthur found her there, and she smiled, tenderly, faithfully. But there was a distance in her smile, like a reflection seen across deep water. He never questioned it. He loved her too much to imagine anything shadowed in her light. And yet, there were moments, and brief, cruelly beautiful moments, when she would look up at Lancelot from across the table, and the space between them would fill with a silence so dense that even the fire dared not crackle. Merlin felt it, though he never looked directly at them. His gift was not of sight, but of understanding. One night, he spoke to Arthur as they walked the battlements, the city sleeping beneath them like a field of candles. "Every kingdom," he said, "has two hearts, one that beats in its people and one that beats in its king. When they fall out of rhythm, even heaven will hear the silence." Arthur turned, the torchlight soft on his face. "You speak as if I have done wrong." Merlin smiled, sad and kind. "You have done nothing wrong, my king. That is the danger." The mists began to thicken that summer, not the mists of weather, but of mood. Strange tales came from the edges of the realm, of restlessness among the northern lords, of old pagan fires burning again in the western hills, of whispers that the old gods had not gone, but only slept beneath their stones. Camelot still glittered, but in its perfection there was strain. The knights, who once shared laughter without armor, now began to carry their swords more often, even to supper. Gawain grew impatient at peace. Tristram rode too far on solitary hunts. Percival's eyes turned inward, as if searching for a vision the earth could not give. Only Lancelot seemed calm, and that calm was its own unease. He spent his days training the younger squires, teaching them to fight without cruelty, to fall without shame. But when the day's dust settled and the field emptied, he lingered alone, tracing circles in the sand with the tip of his blade. He did not know what he was seeking. Perhaps forgiveness. Perhaps escape. Sometimes, Guinevere would watch from the balcony, not openly, but through the lattice of ivy that framed her window. She would see the movement of his shoulders, the discipline in every motion, and feel her heart rise like a bird trapped in the cage of her own ribs. She would whisper to herself, "It is nothing." But nothing, whispered often enough, becomes a spell. One evening, as twilight melted into indigo, Arthur found Merlin sitting by the edge of the reflecting pool, where the willows leaned low and the stars gathered early. The old man's staff rested across his knees, and his gaze was lost in the mirrored water. "Are you reading the sky again?" Arthur asked, half smiling. Merlin's voice was distant. Not the sky. The reflection. Arthur sat beside him, watching the ripples widen. "You've grown quiet, old friend." "Quiet," Merlin said, "is the sound of what cannot be undone." Arthur frowned, sensing the weight in his tone. "Speak plainly." Merlin turned to him, and for a moment the torchlight caught in his eyes like lightning in the depths of a well. "There are things, my king. Even I am not permitted to speak plainly. But hear this. When love becomes devotion, it builds. When devotion becomes worship, it destroys. Be watchful of what your light warms, for even flowers can burn if the sun forgets its mercy." Arthur studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I trust them," he said simply. Merlin looked away. "That is why I weep." The moon rose full that night, a white coin laid into the palm of heaven. Below, the river shone like a wound, healing too quickly. The city slept, but dreams were restless. Guinevere dreamed of a forest path lit by the glint of armor. Lancelot dreamed of a voice calling his name and never answering. Arthur dreamed of standing alone in a field of wheat that turned, all at once, to ash. And far away, in the forest of Broceliande, something stirred. Something that had slept since the old gods had been driven into the earth. The owls stopped their hunting. The water stilled. A whisper rose from the soil, coiling through the air like smoke. It carried a name long forgotten, but soon to be spoken again. Morgana. The morning after the full moon broke differently. The sky had the color of bruised pearl, and a wind had risen from the western hills, not cold, but strange, carrying the faintest scent of heather and iron. The doves that nested along the parapets stirred restlessly, their wings beating in uncertain rhythm. Merlin woke before dawn, his heart uneasy. He rose from his chamber and climbed the long spiral stair of the tower. Each step whispered a memory. The day the first beam of Camelot was raised, the night the king had been crowned, the vows that had sealed the fellowship. All of it now felt fragile, like frost before sun. From the highest parapet, he saw her. At first she was only a shape in the mist, small and distant, a dark figure riding alone through the dew-heavy fields below the castle. The horses' hooves made no sound that reached the ear, yet the rhythm of them was unmistakable. Steady, deliberate, a heartbeat carried on air. When she drew closer, the mist parted as if it knew her. She rode bareheaded, her hair spilled like ink across her shoulders, catching what little light the morning offered. Her cloak was deep green, the color of wet moss, and beneath it her gown shimmered faintly, woven with threads that drank the dawn instead of reflecting it. Merlin's breath caught. He whispered her name as one might whisper an old wound. Morgana. She entered Camelot as quietly as twilight enters a room. The guards did not challenge her. The gates seemed to open of their own accord, hinges sighing as if they remembered her touch. By the time she dismounted, half the courtyard had gathered to watch, drawn less by recognition than by a strange gravity that bent the air around her. Arthur came down from the hall to meet her, his cloak still clasped from counsel. When he saw her face, the years fell away. "Sister," he said, his voice soft with disbelief, "you have returned." She bowed low, eyes lowered, but glinting with unreadable light. "If I am still welcome, my king." "Always," Arthur said, and drew her into an embrace. For a heartbeat the crowd exhaled, a sigh of relief, of joy, of nostalgia for a family long scattered by the storm of war. Only Merlin did not move. From the edge of the courtyard, he watched her smile over the king's shoulder. And in that smile he saw both beauty and the reflection of something that had stared too long into the mirror of power. In the days that followed, Camelot rejoiced at her return. Morgana brought laughter, music, and a fragrance of old forests into the marble halls. She spoke gently to the courtiers, kindly to the servants, and when she walked through the gardens, the flowers seemed to lift their heads as if greeting an old queen. Guinevere welcomed her warmly. She had longed for another woman's presence among the endless council of men, and Morgana seemed to fill the room like spring rain after drought. The two spoke often, walking the cloisters together at dusk, their voices mingling like the flight of birds. Yet, unseen, a different music began to hum beneath the beauty. The fires in the hearths burned higher when Morgana entered. The dogs that usually slept beside the gate grew restless in her passing. Once, when a candle guttered near her, its flame bent toward her breath as if drawn by something older than wind. Merlin noticed it all. He confronted her in the garden one evening, where the lavender stood tall and the air trembled with bees. "You bring a strange calm, my lady," he said, leaning on his staff. Morgana turned, her smile soft. "And you bring strange suspicion, old friend." "You have walked where no mortal should," he murmured. "The forest has marked you." Her eyes glimmered like water over obsidian. "The forest taught me what you would not. You speak of destiny as though it belongs to one man. But the world has many hearts, Merlin. Some beat for light, some for the shadow that feeds it. The shadow consumes," he warned. "The shadow remembers," she answered. "Even light forgets its source." She left him there, the scent of crushed herbs rising under her step, her laughter carrying like a chime fading down a long corridor. Merlin bowed his head. The wind around him shifted, cold and sudden. He whispered to the air, "So it begins." In the hall that night, Arthur held a feast in her honor. The round table blazed with candles. The music of harps and pipes filled the rafters. Morgana sat to the king's right, her beauty softened by candlelight, her voice weaving through the talk like silk. She spoke of far journeys, of mountains that glowed at midnight, of lakes that whispered prophecies in sleep. Every tale poured from her lips like honey laced with memory. Even the knights, seasoned in hardship, leaned forward to listen. Only Lancelot seemed uneasy. Each time her gaze swept the table, his hand strayed to the hilt of his sword, not from fear, but instinct. He could not name what he felt, only that the air around her pressed a little too close, too sweet. Guinevere sat silent beside her, smiling, though her fingers trembled slightly on the stem of her cup. When Morgana turned toward her, their eyes met. Two mirrors reflecting the same unspoken knowledge, that beauty and danger are often sisters. After the feast, when the hall had emptied and the torches burned low, Arthur and Morgana walked alone through the colonnade. The moon lay like a spill of milk across the flagstones. "It gladdens me to have you home," Arthur said. "The court has missed your grace." Morgana smiled faintly. "Has it missed my questions too?" Arthur laughed softly. "Ask them." "I have missed that most." She stopped, turning to face him. The moonlight silvered her hair. "Do you believe all this peace will last?" "If we are just and faithful, yes." She studied him a moment longer. "You speak as if justice were a blade that cuts only one way. But I have seen the other edge, brother. It shines just as bright." Arthur frowned. "Do not let the past darken what we have built." "The past is not dark," she said quietly. "It waits." Before he could answer, she turned and walked into the garden, her shadow merging with the ivy, her steps soundless. Arthur stood for a time, watching the moonlight where she had been, uneasy without knowing why. Above the highest tower, Merlin watched too, his hand gripping his staff until the wood creaked. He whispered a single plea to the silent sky. Let him see before it is too late. But the wind did not answer. And so, within the heart of Camelot, the most radiant kingdom under heaven, a thread of darkness wound itself quietly through the gold, fine as silk, unseen, unbroken. The torches still burned, the laughter still rang, and the round table still gleamed beneath its circle of vows. Yet, for the first time, the light no longer reached every corner, and in that untouched shadow, something began to breathe. The summer that followed was strange. The days were bright, yet their brightness seemed brittle, like glass too thin to hold its own reflection. The meadows were heavy with bloom, but the air carried an unease that no perfume could soften. Even the river, once the calm heartbeat of Camelot, murmured as though whispering to itself in doubt. Merlin felt it most keenly. He wandered the edges of the city now, his cloak trailing dew, his eyes turned toward the horizon where the sky met the ancient hills. He could sense it, a shift, subtle but sure, like the tightening of a string before it breaks. At times, when the wind rose from the west, he caught faint voices, distant and sorrowful, echoing through the veil between worlds. The world of men was stirring too loudly. One evening, as twilight gathered, Arthur found him in the chapel, the quiet place of stone and candlelight where prayers were more whisper than sound. The king entered softly, his armor dimmed with dust from the day's patrol. "Merlin," he said, his voice breaking the hush, "you've been apart from us." Speak, old friend. What shadow do you see now? Merlin did not turn. The flame of the nearest candle wavered, though there was no wind. A shadow, he said slowly, that begins in light itself. It is not the darkness that frightens me, Arthur. It is what men will do to keep their light from fading. Arthur frowned. You speak in riddles again. The old man sighed. Then let me speak plainly. Your knights, the same hearts that built your dream, have begun to hunger for something they cannot name. Peace has dulled their swords, and where the edge of war once gleamed, now a dull ache of purpose remains. It is not enough for them to serve. They must seek. Arthur's gaze lowered to the sword at his hip. Excalibur, silent and waiting. And what is there left to seek, Merlin? We have peace, honor, love. Perfection, Merlin interrupted gently. And perfection is a dangerous thirst. There are whispers of a relic, a cup said to carry the last breath of the divine. They call it the Grail, and already, some among your fellowship dream of finding it. Arthur's hand tightened on the hilt. A relic of faith or of pride? Merlin's eyes were dark as storm water. Both, if men forget which hand holds it. The first dream came to Percival. He awoke before dawn, heart hammering, his face wet with tears he could not explain. He had seen a light, not the light of the sun or of fire, but something purer, softer, like music turned to color. In that light, a voice had called his name, not in command, but in invitation. He rose and went to the river, still shrouded in morning mist, and knelt. The water was calm, but as he stared into it, shapes moved beneath the surface, wings perhaps, or the shadows of lilies. A cup appeared in his mind's eye, simple, unadorned, carved from stone. It was not beautiful, yet he could not look away. When he returned to the hall, his eyes burned with quiet fire. I have seen it, he whispered to the others. The Grail. It waits for us beyond the veil of the world. Gawain laughed, shaking his head. You've seen a dream, not a cup. But Lancelot said nothing. His gaze had fixed on the sword Excalibur resting by Arthur's chair. Something about its light, cold, unyielding, perfect, stirred the same unease that now haunted his own heart. Arthur listened to them all and felt the weight of something vast pressing against the edges of his reign. By autumn, the visions had spread. Each knight saw them differently. Bedivere in the shape of a dove, rising from a field of ashes. Galahad in the shimmer of sunlight through glass. Gawain in the gleam of rain upon his blade. The Grail had no single face. It was what each man most desired and most feared. Merlin called it the calling of the pure. But purity, he knew, was not without its cruelty. He sought Arthur again one night when the stars were pale and cold above the battlements. The Grail has woken, he said, and with it, the reckoning of hearts. Arthur turned from the wall, his face weary. And if it is truly divine, must we not follow it? Merlin's staff struck the stone, sharp as thunder. Follow it, yes, but not all who follow light return unburned. Would you have me deny them the quest? I would have you remind them that holiness is not found in distance. The Grail they seek lies not in valleys or caves, but in the mercy they have yet to master. Arthur looked away, troubled. And if they will not listen? Merlin's voice softened. Then, my king, you must let them go, even if it breaks your heart. When morning came, the air was heavy with prophecy. The knights gathered in the great hall, the torches dim, the round table glowing with the last embers of dawn. Each man stood, one by one, and spoke of the vision he had seen, the voice he had heard. Arthur watched them with pride and fear mingled in equal measure. He knew he could not hold them back. The dream had already taken root, and once a dream blooms in a man's soul, not even a crown can command it. So he rose, his voice steady. If the Grail calls you, then go. Seek it not for glory, but for grace. Let no man raise his sword in pride, nor carry his banner above his mercy. Bring me not the cup of gold, but the proof of a heart made whole. Lancelot bowed first, his eyes shining in the half-light. Then I will ride, my king. Percival knelt beside him, his voice trembling with faith. And I. One by one, the fellowship bent their knees, the circle of light around them breaking open like a flower before the storm. Merlin turned away, hiding his tears. He had seen too many dawns that began in beauty and ended in ash. And as the first trumpet sounded and the gates of Camelot opened, Arthur felt the wind rise, cold and sharp, carrying with it the scent of farewell. He stood upon the steps as his knights rode out, their banners gleaming, their laughter echoing through the valley. And in the distance, the sun rose, a perfect, merciless sphere of light. They rode out through the gates of Camelot at dawn, when the sky was still half asleep and the mist clung to the fields like the memory of dreams. Their armor gleamed, silver beneath the pale light. Their banners hung heavy with dew. Hooves struck the cobblestones like slow heartbeats. From the windows of the high hall, Guinevere watched them go, her hand resting against the cold glass, her breath clouding it briefly before fading away. Arthur stood on the steps below, bareheaded, his cloak stirring in the morning wind. He said no word of command, only watched, his eyes following the fellowship as they disappeared one by one into the brightness of the horizon. When the last echo of hooves was gone, Merlin came to stand beside him. "They will not all return," the old man said softly. Arthur's gaze did not waver. "No king should expect to keep what he lends to heaven." Merlin's staff touched the stone. "And yet every loss will carve you hollow." Arthur smiled faintly. "Then let me be hollow, so that mercy may have room to dwell." The knights scattered to the winds. Percival rode north, following the river that wound through fields of heather and stone. The wind there carried a purity that felt close to prayer. He rode for weeks, sleeping beneath the stars, eating what the land gave, and listening for the voice that had once called him in his dream. One night, by a black lake surrounded by pines, he saw it again, a glimmer, faint and holy, upon the water. He dismounted and knelt. The reflection was of no cup, but of himself, older, tired, yet serene. The voice came again, soft as breath. "The Grail does not await you, Percival. It awakens within you," he wept quietly. And when he rose, the lake was only a lake, the stars only stars. Yet he rode on with lighter heart, as if the road itself had turned into a kind of prayer. Gawain took the western path, a road of cliffs and salt. He chased rumor and challenged both, riding into storm and wind, shouting to the sea for guidance. His courage was vast, but his patience small. When he came upon a hermit by the shore, he demanded, "Have you seen the Grail?" The hermit smiled. "I have seen the tide. It comes and goes, and never asks to be found." Gawain frowned, angry and humbled. He remained there for 3 days, watching the sea breathe, until he realized the truth in the old man's words, that some quests are meant to teach stillness, not victory. Lancelot rode alone into the forest of Broceliande. The trees there grew close together, their trunks black with moss, their branches heavy with mist. It was said that those who entered that forest met not beasts, but their own hearts. He rode until his horse grew restless and would go no farther. Then he dismounted and walked, his armor dim, his face hidden by shadow. Every sound around him seemed alive. The rustle of leaves, the slow trickle of unseen water, the distant cry of something neither bird nor human. At last he came to a clearing, where a single pool lay, still and silver beneath a canopy of trees. He knelt beside it and saw not his reflection, but the face of the queen. Her eyes were full of sorrow, and her lips moved as if to speak his name. But the voice that answered was his own, echoing softly through the forest. You cannot serve two masters, love and honor. Choose and lose the other. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the pool was dark again. He rode out of the forest at dawn, his armor dented, his spirit quieter. The light touched his face like forgiveness, though he did not yet know for what. Back in Camelot, the round table stood empty, its surface gathering dust like a memory gone too long without touch. Guinevere sat alone beside it some evenings, tracing her fingers along the carved words. We will listen. She wondered if the table could still hear across the distance, across the fields, the mountains, the prayers. Morgana found her there one night. You look as though you mourn the living, she said. Guinevere started. I mourn what I cannot name. Morgana stepped closer, her face soft in the candlelight. You have given too much of yourself to dreams that were never yours. Men build kingdoms, and we tend their ghosts. Guinevere looked up. And you? What ghosts do you tend? For a moment, the witch's eyes shone with something like grief. Then it was gone. My own, she said simply, and left her standing in the hush of the empty hall. In the tower above, Merlin kept vigil. He had ceased to eat, ceased to rest. The world had begun to blur around him, the boundary between vision and reality thinning like old parchment. He saw the knights in their wanderings, Gawain beneath the cliffs, Percival by the lake, Lancelot in the forest. And he saw something else too, a thread of dark light weaving through their paths, binding them still to Camelot, to Morgana, to destiny itself. He knew then what must come. He went to Arthur and found him in the chapel, alone before the altar. The sword and the cup, Merlin said, are not separate. The same hand that wields one must one day release the other. Arthur bowed his head. Then I will keep faith until that day. Merlin laid a hand on his shoulder, his voice breaking. You will, my king. That is why it will destroy you. That night, as rain fell over Camelot, thunder rolled in the distance, not the fury of a storm, but the slow awakening of fate. Morgana stood at her window, watching the lightning trace silver veins across the sky. In her palm she held a small vial of water, taken from the pool of the forest. It glowed faintly, pulsing with its own secret light. Soon, she whispered, the light will belong to the night again. Below, the candles in the great hall flickered, and one by one, they went out. Autumn returned to Camelot with a hush. The wind came softer now, carrying not the scent of battle or harvest, but of rain-soaked leaves and the faint sweetness of apples fallen too soon. The towers stood pale against the silver sky, their banners weary from too much sunlight. The laughter that once rang through the courtyards had gentled to murmurs like the sea after a storm. Arthur walked the battlements alone. His knights were scattered, some still chasing visions of the Grail, others lost to the silence of their own hearts. The Round Table sat empty for days at a time, its polished surface gathering dust like a forgotten prayer. He missed the noise, the clash of opinions, the reckless laughter, the arguments that ended in shared bread and forgiveness. Even peace, he had come to learn, could be a kind of solitude. Sometimes, in the deep hours before dawn, he thought he could hear the echo of their voices, not ghosts, but memories replaying themselves to fill the void. When sleep came, it was thin and restless. He dreamed of light breaking through mist, only to vanish before it reached the ground. Merlin no longer stood beside him on the walls. The old wizard had retreated into his tower, consumed by omens that refused to resolve themselves. The stars had grown unfamiliar to him. Their patterns no longer spoke in the language he knew. He feared the future, not for its cruelty, but for its inevitability. And below, within the heart of Camelot, Guinevere moved like silence in silk. She had not been herself since the night's departure. Each evening, she walked the corridors by candlelight, her fingertips grazing the cold stone as though searching for warmth it could not give. The servants bowed and passed her with reverence, but also pity. They whispered that the queen's smile had grown too thin, too distant, that her eyes lingered too long on the horizon. She spent her mornings among the gardens, pruning roses that no longer bloomed, speaking softly to the air, as if it might answer. Sometimes she would kneel and press her hands into the soil, as though she might feel the heartbeat of the land itself, and know whether it still belonged to her. The nights were worse. She could not sleep. The wind in the windows sounded like footsteps. The fire whispered names she did not dare to hear, and always, beneath every thought, was the memory of Lancelot's eyes, not their color, but the quiet honesty of them, the way they had looked at her without demand or plea, as if love were something sacred enough to bear in silence. She had told herself it was over, that time and distance had cured it. But love, once named in the soul, never dies. It only changes shape, hiding itself in sighs and pauses, in kindnesses too small to betray their cause. He returned to Camelot in late November. It was raining the day he rode through the gates, a slow, fine rain that blurred the edges of everything. His armor was unpolished, his cloak frayed, his horse thin from the road. Yet when he dismounted in the courtyard, the guards bowed low, for even in weariness there was something noble about him, something that had not been dulled by distance. Arthur came down from the hall to greet him. "Welcome home, my friend," he said, embracing him. "Tell me, did you find what you sought?" Lancelot smiled faintly. "I found what I could lose, and lost what I could not find." Arthur laughed softly. "You speak like Merlin. That's how I know the road has taught you something." He clapped him on the shoulder and led him inside, never noticing how Lancelot's gaze lingered on the great window at the far end of the hall, the one that looked toward the Queen's garden. That night, a feast was held to honor his return. The hall shone with golden light, the air fragrant with wine and pine smoke. Guinevere sat beside the king, her hands folded, her composure flawless. Yet when Lancelot entered, something in the air shifted. The candles seemed to lean toward him. The murmurs of conversation softened. like the sea drawing breath before a wave. He bowed low before the throne. "My queen," he said, his voice quiet but clear. Her heart stilled. It had been months since she had heard that voice, and yet it felt like no time at all. She wanted to speak, to greet him as any queen might. But the words caught and turned to light behind her eyes. Arthur rose, raising his cup. "To Lancelot, my brother in arms, whose courage has outlasted even the road." The hall cheered. But beneath the noise, Guinevere and Lancelot exchanged a single glance, fleeting, soft, and ruinous. It was not longing. It was recognition. Two hearts, once bound by silence, realizing they still shared the same wound. Later that evening, when the feast had ended and the laughter had ebbed to quiet, Guinevere left the hall. The corridors were empty, lit only by the glow of oil lamps. Her footsteps echoed softly against the stone. In the cloister, she paused. The rain had ceased. The air smelled of wet earth and the distant river. She turned a corner, and there he was. Lancelot stood beneath the archway, his cloak dark with rain, his head bowed as though praying. When he heard her, he turned. For a moment neither spoke. The silence between them was vast enough to hold a lifetime. "My lady," he said finally. "Why did you come back?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled at her sides. "For the king," he said. And then, after a pause, softer, "and for what I left behind." The words hung between them like a suspended note. "You should not say such things," she whispered. "I know." He took a slow breath. "And yet, I have said them every night in my heart." The rain began again, gentle, almost kind. It fell between them like forgiveness neither dared to accept. Guinevere turned away first. "Go," she said, "before silence betrays us." But even as she walked from him, her heart whispered his name, the way a harp string hums long after the hand has left it. That night, neither of them slept. Lancelot sat by his window, watching the clouds drift over the moon. He thought of duty, of oaths, of the endless road that led from loyalty to despair. He loved his king. He would die for him without hesitation. And yet, in the quiet of his own heart, he would have given every victory, every scar, every breath of his life for a single moment in which he did not have to love Guinevere in silence. And in her chamber, the queen lay awake, her hair loose upon the pillow, the candle at her bedside burning low. She thought of the world she had chosen, the throne, the vows, the golden cage that shone too bright to escape. She thought of the knight who had never once asked her to. The wind sighed against the window. Somewhere, far below, the river turned in its sleep. And in that vast stillness, their hearts, separated by stone, by law, by time, beat in the same quiet rhythm. The rain did not stop for 7 days. It fell like a benediction over Camelot. Slow, silver, endless. The gardens flooded softly, the trees bent beneath the weight of wet blossoms, and the world outside the castle blurred into a watercolor of green and gray. Inside, the torches burned low, the walls hummed with silence, and footsteps echoed like forgotten thoughts. The air was thick with the scent of rain and wax, and the hush of it all pressed gently on every soul, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Guinevere moved through the days, like someone walking through a dream too fragile to wake from. She smiled where she must, spoke when she was spoken to, but her heart was elsewhere, not in rebellion, but in exile. Even her ladies noticed the stillness in her gestures, the faraway shimmer in her gaze. They whispered that the queen had grown more beautiful, though none could say why. Beauty, they said, has its seasons, and hers had become that of twilight. On the 8th night, the rain ceased. The moon rose huge and pale, a lantern caught in drifting mist. From the courtyard came the sound of dripping eaves, of water finding its way home to the river. Guinevere could not sleep. The walls felt too close, the silence too loud. She rose, wrapped herself in a shawl of white linen, and lit a single candle. Its light wavered on the stone, guiding her through the corridors, like a thought she could not let go. She did not know where she was going until she arrived. The chapel stood at the edge of the gardens. Small, built of gray stone veined with ivy. The door was unbarred. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and fading incense. A single lamp burned before the altar, its flame small but unwavering. She knelt, as she had so many times before, and tried to pray, but the words would not come. What does one pray for, she thought, when the heart is both guilty and true? Behind her, the door creaked softly. She turned, and there he was. Lancelot stood in the doorway, the light from the hall falling around him like the last warmth of day. He hadn't come to seek her. He had come because he could not bear not to. For a long time they simply looked at each other, and the silence between them was not absence, but fullness, the kind that hums just before a song begins. "My lady," he said at last, his voice low. "You should not be here," she whispered. "I know," he said, "and yet I am." The candlelight trembled between them. Shadows rippled across the walls like breath. She rose slowly, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. "You will ruin us," she said, though her voice trembled not with fear, but with longing. He took a step closer. "Then let the ruin be gentle." Her eyes filled with tears. "You speak of gentleness as if the world would permit it." "The world is not here," he said, and his voice broke softly. "Only we are." For a heartbeat, time folded. The air between them closed, the distance of 1,000 vows dissolving in the span of a single breath. His hand rose, not bold, but reverent, and brushed the edge of her hair, tracing the tremor that ran through her. Guinevere's eyes fluttered shut. "Don't," she whispered. But her voice was not a command. It was a confession. Lancelot drew his hand back, as if burned, his breath shuddering. "Forgive me." "There is nothing to forgive," she said, "only to endure." She turned toward the altar, her hands trembling. "I have prayed for strength," she said, "but I think the gods have mistaken me for someone stronger." He stepped beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, the scent of rain and iron on his cloak. "Then let me be your strength," he said. She shook her head slowly. "No, be my silence." He looked at her then, really looked, not as a queen, not as a forbidden dream, but as a soul breaking open under the weight of its own goodness. He wanted to speak, to swear something, to promise her a peace neither of them could keep. But no words were worthy. So he knelt beside her instead, and together they said nothing. The candle flame steadied, and for a while the world was pure again. Two hearts beating beneath the eye of heaven, still unbroken, still whole. Outside, Merlin stood beneath the chapel's window. He had not come to spy, only to know. The rain had soaked his cloak. His staff was slick with water. He listened to the silence within. Not what was said, but what was not. When he turned away, his face was lined with sorrow, deeper than age. "So it has begun," he murmured. "And love, the most innocent of angels, has learned the shape of a sword." He walked back toward the tower, each step heavy with the knowledge that there are prophecies even he would rather not see fulfilled. Inside the chapel, the candle finally guttered. Guinevere opened her eyes. The flame was gone, but its light remained in the air, faint and gold, like something that could not bear to vanish completely. She rose. "You must go," she said softly. He nodded. "If I go, my heart will stay." "Then let it," she whispered, "but never let it speak." When he reached the door, she called after him, not to stop him, but because some part of her could not bear silence. "Lancelot." He turned. Her eyes met his, filled with everything they could never say. "If there is another life," she said, "let us meet there without crowns or swords between us." He bowed his head. "Then I will find you." And with that, he was gone, leaving the door open to the moonlight, and the queen alone in a room still warm with the echo of his presence. That night, Guinevere did not cry. She sat by the window until dawn, watching the stars fade one by one, as if heaven itself were trying to forget what it had seen. Far away, in the forest of Broceliande, the wind carried a different voice. Morgana's laughter, low and knowing. "Love," she whispered to the darkness, "is the sweetest path to ruin." The trees shivered, as though agreeing. Winter came to Camelot, like a memory the world had tried to forget. The trees stood bare against a colorless sky, and the wind that moved through the courtyards carried the scent of iron, sharp, clean, and cold. The river froze at its edges, and when the bells rang across the city, their sound broke upon the frost-like glass. Within the hall, the fires burned high, but the warmth felt thin, uncertain. The laughter that once lived there had gone quiet. Every voice now carried an echo of something unspoken. The knights had returned, some from their search for the Grail, others from wars no one had declared aloud. Each bore a different silence. Lancelot had come back changed. He smiled as he always had, bowed as deeply, spoke as gently. And yet, something in him no longer belonged to the light. His eyes had grown more thoughtful, his gestures slower, as though every word he spoke first passed through a battlefield in his heart. Guinevere saw it, and the sight hurt her. She moved through the days like someone treading a river of glass, each step careful, each breath measured, knowing that one wrong sound could shatter everything. And Arthur, poor Arthur, saw none of it clearly, though he felt its weight everywhere. In the quiet between words, in the way his friends averted their eyes, in the sudden cold that entered rooms without opening doors. Merlin had vanished from the court. No one knew when he had gone. Only that his tower window had stood open one morning, the curtains stirring though there was no wind. On the table lay his staff and a single parchment upon which 3 words were written, small and dark as the roots of prophecy. "The heart will choose." Arthur read them again and again, but the meaning changed each time, like light shifting through water. In the absence of Merlin, the council grew restless. Rumors ran like wild horses through the halls. Whispers of rebellion in the north, of Morgana seen riding beneath the new moon, her cloak a shadow that moved against the stars. Some said she had gathered those who had lost faith in the crown. Others said she did not need to gather them, that she had simply spoken their doubts aloud, and they had come willingly. Arthur called his knights to council. They came, Lancelot, Gawain, Bedivere, Percival, and the rest, their armor dull from neglect, their faces lined with sleeplessness. The round table gleamed under torchlight, still whole, but the circle no longer felt perfect. "The piece we built is cracking," Arthur said, his hands resting upon the table. "If Morgana seeks to unmake it, then we must ride against her before her lies take root." Gawain's fist struck the table. "Then give the word, my king. We will ride tonight." But Arthur shook his head. "Not with anger. I will not meet darkness with haste." "We must be sure Lancelot said nothing." His gaze was on the table's edge, where the candlelight trembled in the grain of the wood. Arthur turned to him. "You are silent, my friend." "Speak." Lancelot looked up slowly, his expression calm but tired. "The shadow grows not only outside the walls, my king. It lives where we love too much." Arthur frowned. "What do you mean?" "Only that even light, when hoarded, becomes its own darkness," Lancelot said softly. No one understood. Not yet. That night, Guinevere walked alone in the cloisters. The moonlight lay silver upon the stones, and frost glittered on the hedges. She carried no candle. The cold light was enough. Her breath made small clouds in the air. She felt the weight of too many secrets pressing against her ribs, each one beating like a bird, desperate for release. At the far end of the corridor, she saw movement. A figure stepped from the shadows. Morgana. The witch wore a cloak of black velvet lined with silver, and her hair shone like dark fire. She smiled, and the air around her seemed to shift, sweet and heavy. "My queen," she said softly, "you walk as though chased by your own heart." Guinevere's voice trembled. "Why are you here?" "To warn you," Morgana said. "The king suspects nothing, but others do. There are eyes that see beyond what is shown. Be careful whose prayers you answer in the dark." "I have done nothing," Guinevere whispered. Morgana's smile deepened, cruel and kind all at once. "Oh, my dear, the gods care little for what is done. They judge only what is desired." She stepped closer, her perfume sharp as myrrh. Arthur's world was built on purity. One whisper is all it takes to unmake it. "Tell me, if your love must be hidden to survive, is it still love? Or has it already become its own betrayal?" Guinevere took a step back. "You twist everything." "I only mirror," Morgana said, and her eyes gleamed with something like pity. "Look well, my queen. The reflection you fear most is your own with that." She turned and vanished into the dark garden, her footsteps soundless on the frozen ground. Guinevere stood alone, her heart beating like a trapped bird, the air around her trembling with a truth too near to speak aloud. The next morning, the court awoke to rumors. Someone, no one knew who, had seen a shadow leaving the queen's chamber before dawn. Others claimed Lancelot's horse had been moved in the night. By noon, whispers filled the corridors like smoke, thin but choking. Arthur heard them last. He was in the chapel when Bedivere came to him, hesitant, ashamed. The words spilled like stones. "My king. There are those who speak ill of the queen, and of Sir Lancelot." Arthur's hand, resting on Excalibur's hilt, did not move. His face was still, too still. "Ill of them, or of me? My lord, I beg you." "Enough." The word was quiet but final. "Bring me proof, or bring me silence." When Bedivere left, Arthur remained standing before the altar for a long time. The candles flickered, bending toward him as if seeking forgiveness. He stared at the blade before him, the weapon that had chosen him once, bright and innocent. Now its reflection trembled in his eyes like water. He whispered, not to the gods, but to himself, "If it is true, let me love them still." Outside, snow began to fall, slow, endless, like the world covering its own footprints. In the tower above, Morgana watched it descend and smiled. "The heart is chosen," she murmured. "Now let the sword remember." And far below, in the stables, Lancelot prepared his horse for flight. The snow did not stop. It fell day after day, until Camelot seemed carved from light and silence. The banners hung motionless, even the bells had frozen in their towers. The air itself had forgotten warmth. Yet beneath that stillness, the kingdom whispered. The rumor had become truth in the mouths of men. Every courtier spoke softly, every servant lowered their eyes. In the great hall, where laughter once rose like song, silence now throbbed like a wound. Arthur sat upon his throne, but felt himself shrinking within it. He had not slept in 3 nights. When he closed his eyes, he saw faces. Guinevere's, pale and steadfast, Lancelot's, shadowed with loyalty and something more painful than guilt. He heard their voices in memory, gentle and kind, and it broke him more than any betrayal could. He did not summon her. He could not. Instead, he summoned Lancelot. The night came at dusk, his cloak wet with melted snow, his face pale with exhaustion. He knelt, not as a guilty man, but as one offering his whole life to judgment. Arthur looked at him for a long time. The firelight flickered between them, gold and red, mercy and wrath. "My friend," the king said softly, "tell me the truth, and I will forgive you before you speak it." Lancelot bowed his head. "My king, I have loved what was never mine, but I have done nothing to shame your crown." Arthur's voice trembled. "And yet your heart has divided my house." "My heart," Lancelot whispered, "was yours first. You made me what I am. You taught me honor, and it was honor that made me silent." The king's hand clenched around Excalibur's hilt, then loosened. For a moment, he looked not like a ruler, but a man. Tired, bewildered, afraid of the truth he had asked for. "If I could cut my heart in 2, Arthur said, "I would give half to justice and half to mercy." "But a king cannot bleed like other men." Lancelot raised his eyes. "Then let me bear the bleeding for you." The words hung between them, too heavy for either to carry, too sacred to take back. Arthur turned away. "Go." "Before I remember what a king must do," Lancelot rose, bowed deeply, and left. The door closed behind him like the end of a prayer. That night, the truth reached the court. Someone, perhaps Morgana, perhaps fate itself, had loosed the story to every ear that longed to hear it. By morning, the city was awake with whispers. By noon, the whispers had become a chant. The queen was taken from her chambers under guard. The snow fell thick and fast, catching in her hair, her lashes, her pale hands bound loosely before her. She did not struggle, nor did she speak. She looked straight ahead, her expression calm, as though her silence were a kind of dignity no chain could break. Arthur watched from the balcony. When the soldiers led her past, she raised her eyes once, and their gazes met. Something in that single look shattered the world. He wanted to call out, to tell them all to stop, to confess his own weakness, to throw down the sword and the crown together, but he did not. A king, he told himself, cannot be only a man. That night, the people gathered in the square below the hall. Torches flaring in the wind, they demanded justice. the same justice Arthur had built his reign upon. He stood before them, tall and still, the crown heavy on his brow. "Justice," he said, "is not vengeance." But they did not hear him. The hunger for righteousness had grown into something else, something darker. And then, through the noise, a voice rose from the edge of the crowd. Clear, commanding, unmistakable. Morgana. She stepped forward, her cloak billowing like a living thing. "The king speaks of mercy, while his house rots from within," she said. "His knights die for love of his lies, his queen for love of another." "Is this the order of Camelot?" the crowd murmured. The wind turned colder. Arthur's voice was steady, but his hands trembled. "You speak of truth as though you are free of sin." "I am free of illusion," Morgana answered. "Your dream was beautiful, brother. But beauty cannot rule men. They will always follow what they fear." With that, she turned and vanished into the storm, leaving her words like poison in the snow. That same night, Lancelot returned. He came not as a knight, but as a man driven by love beyond reason. His followers rode with him, loyal knights who could not stand by and watch their queen condemned. The gates of Camelot burst open under steel and fire. The snow turned red. The city that had once sung of light now screamed in its shadow. Arthur stood in the hall, Excalibur gleaming in his hand, his crown tilted by the tremor of the earth beneath him. Lancelot's men stormed the courtyard. The guards fell one by one. When Lancelot reached the great doors, Arthur was waiting. Their eyes met across the threshold, two souls bound by everything noble and undone by everything human. "Stand aside," Lancelot said. "I will take her, and we will go where no one need speak her name again." Arthur's face was pale, almost serene. "If you cross this hall, you cross my heart." Lancelot stepped forward, snow melting beneath his boots. "Then may it be a wound we both remember." Their swords met. Once, twice, again. Each clash a word too fierce to be spoken. Sparks flew, light against darkness, love against duty. Around them, the hall burned. At last, Arthur's blade struck true, grazing Lancelot's shoulder. The knight stumbled, blood bright on the marble floor. But he did not fall. Instead, he lowered his sword, his voice breaking. "Strike again, if it will heal you." Arthur froze. The rage drained from him, leaving only grief. "I cannot," he whispered. And in that hesitation, Lancelot turned, seized Guinevere's hand, and fled into the storm. When dawn came, Camelot was silent. The fires still smoldered. The snow was ash-gray. Arthur walked through the wreckage, unarmed, uncrowned. On the steps of the chapel, he found Merlin's staff, the one the old wizard had left behind. He lifted it slowly, feeling its weight, and for the first time in his life, he understood the sorrow that had always lived in Merlin's eyes. The dream was not lost, he thought. It had only outgrown its keeper. He looked to the horizon, where the snow and the sky met in a single colorless light. Somewhere beyond it, his queen and his brother in arms rode toward exile. He did not curse them. He did not pray for their return. He simply whispered to the wind, "Let them find peace where I could not." And the wind, in its mercy, did not answer. The winter passed, but Camelot did not awaken with spring. Its towers still stood, proud and white against the horizon. Yet the songs that once rose from its courtyards had gone silent. The meadows below were trampled by war. The air tasted of smoke and salt, and even the river that once mirrored the sky now carried ash upon its surface. Arthur's heart was heavy, but not with anger, with weariness. Each morning he donned his armor in silence, not for glory, but because the weight reminded him he was still alive. He rode among the men, not as a king above them, but as a brother among the doomed. The banners of Morgana's armies could be seen on the far hills now, black against the pale mist, a sea of shadows moving like tide toward the walls. She had gathered the discontent, the broken, the forgotten. Her legions were not only soldiers, but men who had once believed in Camelot and now hungered for its ruin. At night, their fires glowed in the distance, like a constellation of fallen stars. Arthur would stand upon the battlements and watch them, saying nothing, his hands resting on the cold stone. Sometimes he thought he heard voices in the wind, the laughter of days long gone, the echoes of names he had once spoken with pride. Lancelot, Guinevere, Percival, Gawain, all now scattered ghosts of the same dream. One evening, as dusk bled slowly into the sky, a cloaked figure approached the gates. The guards raised their spears, but a single gesture stopped them. The figure lowered his hood. It was Merlin. He looked older, not merely by years, but by centuries. His hair, once silver, was now the color of snow left too long in shadow. His eyes, though dimmer, still carried that strange light, not of fire, but of understanding. Arthur met him halfway across the courtyard. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was that of two souls who had already said everything that mattered. Then the king bowed his head. "You left me when I needed you most." Merlin's voice was gentle. "No, my king. I left when you no longer needed me, and now I return because you no longer believe that." Arthur's eyes burned. "You were right. The dream is broken." "No," Merlin said. "Dreams do not break. They change shape. The light of a torch dies only when the dawn comes." Arthur looked toward the dark hills. "Then what is this? Dawn or dusk?" Merlin smiled faintly. "Both." They walked together through the ruined gardens. The roses were dead, their thorns gleaming like tiny swords. The fountains had dried, and the statues were veiled in moss. Yet the air still carried a quiet holiness, as if the land itself remembered beauty even in ruin. "You built a world that asked men to be good," Merlin said. "And they were, for a time. But goodness, like any light, blinds those who stare too long." Arthur stopped beside the broken fountain. "And what of me?" he asked. "Was I blind too?" Merlin looked at him with infinite sadness. "You saw too much, my king. You loved too deeply to be only a ruler. That is your curse and your grace." A wind rose through the empty garden, carrying the faint sound of drums from beyond the walls, Morgana's army preparing to march. Arthur turned to him. "Will we win?" Merlin's eyes reflected the red glow on the horizon. "You will not. But victory was never yours to keep. You were born not to conquer, but to remind the world that light exists." Arthur's hand trembled on Excalibur's hilt. "Then my story ends with failure." Merlin shook his head slowly. "No, Arthur. It ends with peace, the kind that cannot live beside crowns and swords." That night, the army assembled. The men stood in silence, their armor dull beneath the moon. Some prayed, others simply looked at their hands, remembering the weight of what they had built and what they would soon lose. Arthur rode before them, his white cloak dragging through the mud. He carried no banner, only Excalibur, its edge pale as moonlight. He spoke softly, yet his words carried over the field. "My brothers, we ride not for victory, but for remembrance. Whatever happens this night, let the world know that once we believed, not in power, but in honor, not in kingdoms, but in the good that men may carry in their hearts. When the dawn comes, and we are gone, let them say that for a moment there was light beneath the stone. The men bowed their heads. Even the wind seemed to still. Merlin stood behind him, staff in hand, his face unreadable. "You were always the finest of us," he murmured. "And perhaps that is why the world will not let you stay." Before dawn, as the first pale light crept across the hills, the enemy advanced. The earth trembled with their march, thousands upon thousands moving as one. The sound was not fury, but inevitability. Arthur raised his sword. "For Camelot," he said, not as command, but as farewell. The armies met where mist met dawn. The clash was not of hatred, but of memory, each man fighting for what he believed the world should have been. Steel rang, banners burned, and the ground grew red. From the walls, the people watched and prayed, though no prayer could touch that hour. By midday, the snow had turned to rain. It fell softly over the field, washing the blood into the soil, as if heaven sought to heal what it had allowed to be broken. And through it all, Arthur fought, slow, graceful, unstoppable, like a wave returning again and again to the shore it knows it will never reach. He fought until his horse was slain beneath him, until his men had fallen in circles around him, until only the sound of rain remained. As the last cry faded, the clouds parted, and in that strange quiet, Merlin saw him fall. The wizard ran to the field, his robes heavy with mud. He found the king kneeling, sword still in hand, his eyes lifted toward the horizon where the light began again. Arthur smiled faintly. "It is beautiful, isn't it?" Merlin knelt beside him. "Yes, my king." Arthur's voice was barely a whisper. Tell them I tried." "You did more than try," Merlin said. "You believed." And belief is the seed of every dawn. Arthur's fingers loosened. Excalibur slipped from his grasp, sinking slowly into the wet earth, the blade catching the last light of day, gold, then silver, then gone. Merlin closed the king's eyes and bowed his head. "Sleep now, child of light. The world will dream of you." And as the rain fell, the field grew quiet. The battle ended not with victory, but with silence. When the last sword fell, the wind carried no cries, only the slow whisper of rain over broken steel. The valley lay veiled in mist, white, endless, merciful. It was as though the earth itself refused to remember the shape of what had happened. Merlin sat beside Arthur's body until the light changed. He did not speak. The wizard's hands, once so steady, trembled now as they brushed the king's hair from his forehead. Beneath his fingers, the warmth was fading, but not gone, like an ember buried beneath ash. Far across the field, the few who still lived gathered in silence. They looked not upon a fallen warrior, but upon the ending of a world. When at last the rain ceased, the clouds opened in the west, and a faint glow rose, the color of bronze and morning. The air grew still. The wind smelled of the sea. Merlin raised his head. "It is time," he whispered. They carried Arthur to the river that wound like silver through the hills. There, upon the bank, an old barge waited, dark wood, covered in lilies and woven reeds, as if the forest itself had built it for this 1 hour. No hand had called it. No oar had guided it. It was simply there, born from the mist, patient and silent. The knights, what few remained, laid their king upon it. They wrapped him not in cloth of gold, but in his own cloak, white and plain, the one he had worn in battle. Excalibur rested upon his chest, its hilt gleaming faintly through the folds. No one spoke. The only sound was the water against the hull and the sigh of the reeds. Merlin stood at the prow. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the mist thickened, shimmering faintly as though light itself were breathing. "Where will you take him?" Bedivere asked. Merlin's voice was soft. "To the isle beyond the rain, to Avalon, where wounds heal and kings sleep until the world remembers them again." The knight bowed his head. "And will he return?" Merlin smiled faintly. "When the land is ready to dream once more." As the barge drifted away, the knights fell to their knees upon the bank. They watched until the mist swallowed it whole. The white cloak, the silver blade, the faint glimmer of the wizard's staff. And then there was nothing but the sound of water and the cry of a lone gull circling above. Merlin did not look back. He stood unmoving, his robes heavy with river mist. The air around him shimmered faintly, the way heat dances above stone in summer. The edges of his form began to blur, as though the world had grown tired of holding him. He whispered to the wind, not a spell, not a farewell, but a single truth. No dream ends, it only changes its name. Then he was gone. Only the reeds bent, as if bowing to the place where he had stood. The days that followed were quiet. The people of Camelot buried their dead, rebuilt their homes, and tried to believe in the ordinary again. But some nights, when the fog came in from the river, they swore they could see a faint light moving far beyond the hills. A boat drifting without sound, a sword gleaming faintly in the dark. Children grew up hearing the tale and whispering it to their own, that the once and future king sleeps beneath the mists of Avalon, waiting for the day when honor will rise again in the hearts of men. And though centuries would pass and kingdoms would fall, the story endured, not in scrolls or monuments, but in the quiet hope that lives wherever courage is still remembered. Some say the sword still lies beneath the water, its edge untouched by rust, its promise unbroken. Some say that, in the moment before dawn, if you stand by the river and close your eyes, you can hear the sound of hooves and the murmur of a voice saying, "There was light beneath the stone." And maybe there was. For in every heart that chooses mercy over might, in every soul that dares to believe in what cannot be seen, Camelot breathes again, not as a city of stone, but as a moment of grace, eternal and fleeting, between one breath and the next. The mists have closed, but the dream remains. For Camelot was never just a kingdom. It was every heart that dared to believe in kindness, every soul that chose mercy over might. If you're still awake, thank you for walking with me through the rain and golden firelight of a legend that will never die. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what story would you like to dream next? Until then, may your night be calm, your heart be steady, and your soul rest beneath the light, beneath the stone.